It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hanna Tuomisto to our stage for this session. Hanna is a senior researcher at the University of Helsinki, where she's currently building a research group related to sustainable food systems. Hanna received her master's degree in agroecology from the University of Helsinki in 2007, and a PhD degree from Oxford University in 2011. She then worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre from 2011 to 2015, and then at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine until 2017. Her research interests include the interaction between environmental changes and food systems, and especially how novel food technologies could contribute to the sustainability of food systems. Hanna's contributed to the development of sustainability assessment methods, especially the life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting methods. Her work has emphasised the importance of considering the opportunity costs of land use when comparing the impacts of different farming systems. Hanna was the first researcher who estimated the environmental impacts of meat produced by using cell culturing technologies, and she's currently involved in researching environmental impacts of other novel production technologies. Her work on environmental impacts of organic farming and cultured meat has gained wide media attention, and in addition to speaking for us this morning, Hanna is one of the debaters in this afternoon's public debate, so I'm sure this will whet your interest for that this afternoon as well. But welcome, Hanna. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much as well for inviting me to give a talk here. And I just realized that I'm going to talk quite a lot about everything what you said, so I'm covering kind of all the aspects in my talk, but the topic is sustainable intensification of agriculture. And I will just start with explaining some of these demand challenges that we are facing. As you all know, the population is growing, people are moving to cities, which is causing partly the dietary transition. Also, when people are getting wealthier, they consume more food in calories, and also animal-based foods intake increase. And all of this is causing the need for increased crop production, and so it has been estimated that by 2050 we would need about 25 to 70% more crops than in 2014. And so at the same time we have also production constraints, so the planetary boundaries, which are the boundaries of safe operating space for the humanity. We should try to stay in the limits of these boundaries. But already now we have exceeded some of these boundaries. So climate change is really close, or there are some uncertainty what is the safe boundary. If it's this one, we have already exceeded. If it's this one, we have still some space to go, but here agriculture is of course really important contributor, and as well agriculture has lots of opportunities to mitigate climate change that we will debate later today. Biodiversity, land use change as well, we have already exceeded the biodiversity loss, and here again agriculture is really major player. And freshwater use, agriculture is one of the major users of water, and phosphorus and nitrogen flows are also closely linked to agricultural practices. And then on the other hand, environmental change is also making agriculture more difficult. So especially climate change, the changes in temperature, water availability, increase in CO2 are all directly impacting on crop yields. We have changes in water quality, salinization, acidification, also pathogens and chemicals are causing the quality of crops. Non-renewable resource depletion, especially the depletion of water resources, is causing directly in the decrease of crop yields. Losses of biodiversity are maybe slightly more difficult to model, but at least pollinators that have been in the agenda during the past years, we can model the impacts of those directly on the yields of fruits and vegetables. But then, what are the impacts of changes in the pests and natural predator for pests populations and in the soil biodiversity, and also that we should not forget the genetic diversity of crops that we cultivate, because that's really important from the resilience point of view, from the resilience to environmental changes. If we all grow just one variety of a certain crop and something happens which is really harmful for this variety, then we will lose all the yield. So that's why the crop variety diversity is really important as well. And changes in land quality and use, the land management systems, the impact on soil and land use change in general, like if we lose lots of agricultural land, that's going to have major impacts. And then there is also the stratospheric ozone depletion that causes the increase of UV radiation, but that's now starting to be in the better side, so not so big problem anymore. And now when we look at the models that have estimated the impacts of climate change on crop yields, of course here the uncertainty is huge, but you can see that some areas in the world will benefit, like the northern regions, like Canada and Northern Europe. So the crop yields might increase, but of course there is a lot of uncertainty here as well, because when it gets warmer, we get new pests and diseases, and we have to tackle with those kind of issues. But then the countries that are most food insecure already now, they seem to be suffering the most. And here is to illustrate how difficult it is actually to model the impacts of climate change on crop yields. So here you can see the effect of CO2 increase and the temperature. So if only CO2 increases, but temperature remains the same, so the gray bars, then the crop yields seem to increase. So there is India and Australia in the examples. But then when we have both increase in the temperature and increase in the CO2 levels, then the crop yields might decrease. And we should also consider the nutritional content of crops. So it's not only about the yields, but this is an interesting study by a group in Harvard who looked at the impact of CO2 increase on the nutritional content of crops. And they found that even though the crop yields increase, at the same time, the nutritional content decreases. And especially zinc and iron levels or concentrations decreased in the major crops like wheat, rice, soybeans, and maize. And this is especially, so here in the Western world, it's not so important issue because we will get enough zinc and iron from other sources as well, but this is really important even with these kind of small, relatively small levels, 5–10% changes. This is really important in the developing countries in Africa, where they are already suffering from zinc and iron deficiencies. And this is a paper that actually got published last week, that I published with my group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so in this paper, we reviewed the impacts of climate change on vegetables and legumes. And we found, in terms of yield, we found similar effect that the yields of these vegetables increase because of CO2 increase. But then in terms of the nutritional content, there wasn't any significant change. And then the question, like, how can we make the farming more sustainable and also resilient to environmental changes? And now organic farming is, of course, often in the agenda and proposed as a solution for many of these problems that I just presented. And so just to remind what organic farming is, so in organic farming, it's not allowed to use pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, and also GMOs are not allowed to be used. And then there are higher standards for animal welfare, so the livestock needs to have more space, and there are restrictions for use of antibiotics, for example. So what is the key in organic farming? Where it all started is soil. So it is really about maintaining the long-term fertility and productivity of soil. And that's why in organic farming, what they do, they use crop rotations that include crops with the long roots, because these roots are really important for maintaining the soil quality, the structure, and they leave also lots of organic matter in the soil. And whereas then in conventional farming systems, in monocropping, or where only this kind of cereals with short roots are used, the soil quality is not so good. It gets packed and it's much denser, whereas the organic soils are often more porous, and this is especially important for the water management. So when there are heavy rains and this kind of extreme climatic events, drought, and on the other hand, very wet seasons are becoming more common. So then it's really important to keep good care of the soil, because if the soils are really packed and dense, then they will get flooded when it's rainy, and when it's too dry, the crop yields suffer more than if the soil is in good condition. And but the problem with organic farming is the yields. So when we look at the organic yields, this is average for the whole world. The crop yields are about 20% lower than in conventional farming. And then there was a paper last year published by Adrian Müller who discussed that can organic farming feed the world anyway. And so basically what he concluded was that yes, it can, if we reduce the waste and also reduce the intake of animal-based foods. But then, on the other hand, these are two different issues. So we can still reduce the waste and change the diets, even though we are not using organic farming. And it's not going to happen anyhow directly if we switch to organic farming. Then at the same time we would also reduce waste and the intake of animal-based foods. So this is from my PhD thesis. I carried out a systematic literature review looking at environmental impacts of organic versus conventional farming. This is only including studies in Europe. And what I found in this study was that the soil organic matter in organic farms was generally higher than in conventional farms. And then when we looked at the environmental impacts like nitrogen leaching, nitrous oxide emissions, ammonia emissions, and phosphorus losses per unit of land area, the emissions were lower in organic farming. So it would have benefit if we are really concerned about a specific lake or some waterways and want to reduce the nitrogen leaching and phosphorus losses to that specific lake, then organic farming would have benefits in that area. But then when we look at the impacts per unit of product, because the organic yields are lower, then we can see that so land use requirement per unit of product was much higher in organic farming. That was also partly that's why it's so much higher than the yield difference, because it also includes the nitrogen fixing layers that organic farmers or farms need for getting nitrogen into the soil. And also in organic livestock systems, there are more land area requirements. And but then energy use was lower in organic farming, mainly because of the production of nitrogen fertilizers is quite energy consuming. But then greenhouse gas emissions, there was no difference. Eutrophication and acidification, they were even slightly, or in some cases, much higher in organic farming than in conventional farming. But then when we look at the biodiversity impacts, so these are some more recent papers than my paper. So here it's seen, so here is the 0, which means that everything that is above means that organic is better. So in almost all of these cases, biodiversity was better higher in organic farms. And then also the other study is showing the soil biodiversity, so that was also higher almost systematically in organic farms. But then we become to the question land sharing versus land sparing debate. So is it enough if we only look at the biodiversity on the specific land area, or should we also consider the opportunity cost of land use? So basically land sharing means that we use extensive farming systems that share the land between production of crops and biodiversity, whereas land sparing means that we use higher yielding farming practices. We use less space for agriculture crop production, but then we leave more land outside of agriculture. And here you can see that the first one is the land sharing, and then there are two options for land sparing. So the land sparing can happen at each farm or then in the landscape level, the last one. where a large area is left outside of agriculture for forest or nature conservation areas. And now the evidence shows that in terms of biodiversity, in most cases the land sparing is a better option. So land sharing supports less species than land sparing. And of course there is it always depends on which species we want to conserve, because if we are interested in some specific agriculture species that are really dependent on extensive agricultural practices, then of course land sharing would be the only option. But then these kind of large forest areas and other natural vegetation areas, there are many species that would not be surviving in those kind of land sharing environments, or even in these in the middle, the scenario in the middle where there are only small areas of natural vegetation. So for example, this chocolate-packed kingfisher wouldn't survive in these kind of landscapes. It needs large areas of natural vegetation. And so then the next question is that if we use really intensive agricultural practices, would it actually necessarily mean that we would spare land for nature conservation or forests? And the evidence is really weak in this area, so there is not many studies, but the conclusion basically is that additional policies would be needed that this would happen, because also like if we conserve land somewhere, there can be these rebound effects that then somewhere else land is converted to agricultural land. And then on the other hand, if we already have agricultural land, if we increase production of some crops, then maybe there will be increased demand for other crops or the same crop for other purposes than food, for example, that we use more crops for biofuels or things like that. So these are quite complex issues in practice. And so then now we have seen that it is, from the environmental point of view as well, really important to have high yields. But then this really conventional intensive farming is not necessarily the best option because of all of the environmental issues that it's causing. And that's why the question is that could we use sustainable intensification, so basically trying to produce high yields with low environmental impact and resource use, and how these kind of farming practices would look like. And this is also from my PhD thesis, where I modeled these kind of different farming systems, and including also this land sharing, land sparing debate. So I used different kind of farm models. So the first one is an organic farm, where the whole land area is used for agriculture production. So there are the standard crop rotation, and then there is the grass clover area that is used for nitrogen fixing, and it's not harvested, but it's mulched into the soil. Then there is an organic biogas option, which is otherwise similar, but the grass is harvested for biogas production, and the biogas digested, the remaining after the biogas production is returned back to the field as a fertilizer for the crops, and this increases because the nitrogen fertilizer effect is better after the anaerobic digestion process, so it increases the yields, and that's why in this scenario there is 6% of the land left for other land uses. So all of these farm models use the same area of land, and they also produce the same amount of food crops, and then basically these higher yielding systems, like in conventional system here, only half of the land area is needed to produce the same amount of crops than the organic farming is producing, and so then almost half can be used for other purposes. And then I had this, I called them integrated farming systems, where they were basically conventional farms in the sense that all technologies were allowed, so there was use of pesticides allowed, which was assumed to increase the yield as well. And so in the first model, there was also the biogas integration and also the grass clover for soil maintenance purposes. And then there was the last integrated special system that was using no-till, and it didn't have the grass clover, but it was importing organic fertilizer that came from the communities, like bio-waste and the true biogas reactor. So there was like a closed nutrient cycle between the farm and the community. And now so all of these farms produced the same amount of potatoes, wheat, and field beans, and then the land area that was left outside of agriculture, there were 3 different scenarios that I used. The first one, it was assumed that it was used for miscanthus energy grass, and in the second, natural forest, and then the third one, managed forest. And so then first, if we look at only the environmental impact of wheat production, so allocated the impacts to wheat, which is the standard way when we use life cycle assessment or carbon footprint analysis, that we only look at one crop instead of the whole system. In this kind of analysis, you could see that the conventional farm, the conventional wheat, had highest greenhouse gas emissions per ton of wheat, and most of it was coming from the N2O, nitrous oxide emissions, and also fertilizer manufacture. And then organic, this basic organic scenario had also quite high, but lower than the conventional farm. And then the integrated systems had the lowest carbon footprint. But then when we look at the energy balances of the whole farm, so now taking into account the miscanthus energy grass and also the forests, then you can see that only in the organic farm, so this is how much energy was needed for the tractors and other farm processes. So and in the negative side, so these are balances. So most of these systems that had the energy production involved, they had actually they produced much more energy in the land area than what was needed for the agricultural processes. And then when I assumed that this energy would be used for replacing fossil fuels and looked at the greenhouse gas balances, then also here you can see that the organic farming was the only one that had net greenhouse gas emissions, whereas all of these other systems, they actually had negative greenhouse gas emissions. So they reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than what they produced by replacing fossil fuels. So this kind of illustrates that it always depends on how you look at these issues when you measure the environmental impacts of something. What is the scale, what is the scope, what are the boundaries, what kind of methods you use, it has a huge effect. And then in the end I would like to discuss a little bit about these future food production methods and the extreme intensification that I call here. So now it's really clear that the less land we use for producing a unit of food, the better. So then should we go for vertical farming or hydroponics or then even cellular agriculture, which is the idea of using cell culturing technologies for producing agricultural products. And so there are two different groups of cellular agriculture. So the first one, cellular products, is a group where the cells that are cultivated will form the final product. So example is cultured meat, which is produced by taking animal cells from living animal from the muscle tissue with fine needle biopsies, and then these cells are multiplied and grown in a bioreactor in a nutrition medium, and so then from small number of original cells from the livestock we can produce huge amounts of meat, and that would reduce the need for animals and also potentially reduce the environmental impact a lot. And with the similar technology we could also produce leather or fur or even wood and offals. And then the acellular products are products where we use microbes like fungus or yeast or bacteria that synthesizes some protein, which could be like milk protein or albumin, egg white protein. And then this protein is extracted and used for the final food product. And these are much simpler processes and could be commercialized much sooner than the cultured meat, for example. And these are actually, yesterday somebody presented the Impossible Burger, which is this burger that is available in the US and really tastes like a normal burger. It's mainly vegetarian, but what they have done, they have produced heme protein by using this kind of so they use yeast that synthesizes the heme protein, and the heme protein gives like a metallic taste, like blood-like taste to the burger, and that's the reason why it tastes like real meat. But it's only a small percentage of the, under 1% of the final product, so it's not really the source of proteins in that specific burger, but maybe in the future we could have other meat replacements that would consist mainly from these kind of proteins. And so I have done research about the environmental impacts of cultured meat and also some of these microbial proteins, and these are there is a comparison of the land use. So in terms of cultured meat, which is here, it depends a lot what is the source of the nutrients for the cells. So it could be something like cyanobacteria, which would require very little land, but then it could be some agricultural crops still, like corn, when the land use would be slightly higher. But anyway, compared to beef and sheep especially, it uses much less land. But then, of course, if we were vegetarian and would eat pulses, or even spirulina, the cyanobacteria itself, then the land use requirement would be much lower. And here also the estimates for greenhouse gas emissions. These are, by the way, per unit of protein. So here as well, you can see that cultured meat could reduce the emissions, especially compared to beef and sheep. But then poultry is surprisingly, or not surprisingly, but it is very efficient in these days. So it is quite hard to compete with that. But of course, these estimates have a lot of uncertainty. And then to conclude, so the humanity is facing major food system challenges, we know, and sustainable intensification of agriculture is really important, but at the same time we need policies to conserve forests for carbon mitigation and also for biodiversity conservation. And the soil long-term productivity is really important that we have to remember when we develop these sustainable farming systems, because we need to think about the long-term productivity of the soils when climate change and other environmental changes are happening. And the best practices are always location specific. So in some places it might be still reasonable to use extensive farming practices. And dietary change towards plant-based foods would release more land for other uses. And also these novel technologies can provide major solutions if they will work in large-scale production. And I will leave you with this kind of picture produced by Shohin Meat, which is a Japan-based startup company. Their vision of future cellular agriculture, farming and vertical farming systems. So this is how the agricultural landscape might look like at some point. Thank you very much.